Jason Voorhees, Leatherface, Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, supernatural or otherwise, the 1980s were dominated by slashers. And yet, in the middle of it all, a little 1984 black comedy turned Christmas classic, Gremlins, came out to huge success. Gremlins' family brand of horror helped necessitate the PG-13 movie rating and inspired a host of knockoffs and parody films like Ghoulies, Critters, Munchies, and Hobgoblins before finally releasing its own sequel, Gremlins 2: The New Batch, in 1990. For about a decade, tiny monsters that were equal parts cute and deadly stood toe-to-toe with the titans of horror. But why? Why did the Gremlins find success in the first place? What do the films that shared a subgenre with Gremlins during that time tell us about what makes a tiny monster movie successful? And are the Gremlins due for a comeback, or do they never really go away? Before there were Chris Columbus's capital G Gremlins, Gremlins, lowercase g, had been a part of the cultural lexicon for a really long time, originating from the Old English word gremian, which means to vex. Gremlins were rooted in the same history as creatures like leprechauns, goblins, and fairies. But the gremlin as a concept really took hold during World War II, when British air pilots began assigning blame for unexplained problems with their equipment to small supernatural troublemakers that they called gremlins. The belief in gremlins became so firmly implanted with the cultural consciousness that famous children's author Roald Dahl wrote a book called The Gremlins in 1943, which was supposed to be made into a Disney film, but never got produced. Likewise, Disney's biggest rival at the time, Warner Brothers, produced a Bugs Bunny cartoon in 1943 called Falling Hair, wherein Bugs has to match wits with a gremlin destroying fighter planes. Now fast forward to 1963, and you'll find a very famous Twilight Zone story starring William Shatner called Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, featuring a gremlin on the wing of a commercial airline. The story was so popular, it became a bit of a meme and was retold in the Twilight Zone movie 20 years later in 1983 with John Lithgow in the Shatner role. But the enormous success that Gremlins and its subgenre would enjoy can't be explained with Gremlins' direct predecessors alone. You also have to look at the impact of American history too. Post-World War II, America spent much of the 1950s moving backwards. Women went back to the kitchen, our fear of outside cultures increased, and a strict set of suburban norms became an enforced standard. Segregation and closeted homosexuality were the order of the day until the 1960s and 70s counterculture, which in turn was responded with the 1980s and Ronald Reagan's, let's face it, 1950s 2.0. The 50s fear of outsiders often took the form of little green men from Mars in science fiction, and the 80s was poised to do something very similar. With the Cold War still going and an AIDS epidemic feeding fears of both outsiders and infection, Spielberg produced two films that played into and against both. Poltergeist brought an infestation of the supernatural as a result of Native American culture, while E.T. tried to take the opposite tactic by painting outside cultures and species as something wondrous through the lens of a child's friendship with a benevolent spaceman. At the corner of these two films is Gremlins, a film written by Chris Columbus out of a fear of the rats in his New York City loft. There's your fear of infestation and infection, and it was directed by Joe Dante, whose love of 50s B-movies, many of which played on fear of an alien other, remains legendary even today. And, of course, it was produced by both Steven Spielberg and Star Wars' own Kathleen Kennedy. The Gremlins hit every note. Gizmo the Mogwai that starts everything comes from a shop in Chinatown representing a fear of communism and Eastern culture in general. And that adorable furry creature winds up producing little green men, who, while not from Mars, certainly act as destructive invaders. None of which is to mention how disgusting and diseased the Gremlins look. However, it's through films that were similar either through synchronicity, imitation, or parody that the concept of the Gremlins sustained its prominence. For example, Also released in 1984 was Ghoulies, a film which also included small supernatural monsters. What's interesting about Ghoulies, though, is that unlike Gremlins, they aren't as featured in their first film. The real villain is Malcolm Graves, and then later his son Jonathan Graves is also evil. And also there are these two people who are kind of evil. And in the midst of all of that is the Ghoulies. But by Ghoulies 2, the focus immediately shifted to the Ghoulies specifically. The people behind the series saw the success of Gremlin's specific formula, and then they adapted to that style. Similar is 1986's Critters, which, according to director Stephen Herek, was conceived before Gremlins was released, but was so similar that there had to be rewrites. Interestingly, while the core concept of Little Monsters remained, said monsters, the Krites, wound up actually being from space. Now remember how the Gremlins ape a little bit of that 1950s Green Men from Mars idea? Well, here the Krites are from space, potentially to differentiate themselves from Gremlins, which is wild because it still stays within the zeitgeist that made Gremlins popular in the first place. And then there's Roger Corman's send-up of Gremlins, Munchies, which featured little monsters who were aliens, but who also would replicate themselves if you break one of their rules, just like the Gremlins. In short, Gremlins released the most successful version of a Little Monster story at the perfect time, and then a ton of other people used their same formula, even when they were either trying to differentiate themselves or be a parody. Even a movie like 1988's Hobgoblins, which is notoriously one of the worst movies that Mystery Science Theater 3000 ever riffed, keeps the Gremlins' popularity up with its bad Gremlins-like puppets by virtue of being one of those so bad it's good movies that people will still love to hate watch, even today. Gremlins kicked it off, but in so many ways, these other films kept the Little Monster fever going and even expanded on it. Gremlins started in 1984 and released its sole sequel so far in 1990. And the most successful similar franchises, Critters and Ghoulies, spawned 4 movies apiece, all of which were done by 1994. That's a solid decade of Gremlins and Gremlins-esque movie making before the bubble burst. Kind of. The most interesting aspect of the Gremlins is what they opened the door to, with a little help, that is. You know what came out in 1995? Toy Story. Yes, while franchises like Puppet Master and Chucky continue the evil toy genre on through today, the big money and the cultural zeitgeist started to shift thanks to Pixar, Woody, and Buzz Lightyear. And I think also because Gremlins had paved the way for Toy Story because Gizmo is adorable and good and was basically born to be a best-selling toy, which he was and still is. But also because the Gremlins became pretty likable too when the new batch came out. But Buzz and Woody, they're toys, not monsters, right? So where's the connection to monsters specifically? Well, that comes 1 year later in 1996 when 4 of the most world-changing words were ever uttered. Gotta catch 'em all. It's you and me. Gotta catch 'em all. Pokemon, short for what? Pocket Monster, which is exactly what the Gremlins had been for 10 years. So, Gremlins get nerfed in the mid-90s, they go from chaotic monsters to friendly creatures you can train and be buddies with, and Pokemon, like Gremlins, was joined by a host of similar concepts like Digimon, Monster Hunter, Tamagotchi, Yu-Gi-Oh!, and on and on. Pokemon alone has spawned 122 games, 23 movies, 20 seasons of an animated series, all totaling over 800 individual pocket monsters to catch. You can catch them on your phone if you want to. For over 2 decades, cute monsters have all but supplanted their Gremlins counterparts. However, we have seen one group of small monsters who are both evil yet adorable, critters who don't really speak English exactly, but who you understand nonetheless, bad guys who we still like sometimes, even though their nature is evil, chaotic creatures who are not green, but yellow. If you were wondering if the door was open for Gremlins to really come back, the answer is yes, and you kind of have the Minions to thank for it. Sure, they work for a master villain and not on their own, but so did the Ghoulies, and the Ghoulies are a part of that whole Gremlin genre. And while horror and film snobs in general turn their noses up at the Minions for being sophomoric and overly goofy, their standalone movie grossed over $1 billion worldwide. That's a lot of money in support of a concept that's as close to Gremlins as we've seen in the 21st century. Also, let's be real. Ghoulies and critters both hang out in toilets sometimes, and the Gremlins throw acid on each other from a glass vial clearly marked "Do not throw in face." You can't get much more sophomoric than that. Add to all that the huge resurgence of low-budget, high-yield horror movies, one of which is about a creepy doll, Annabelle, plus a similarly politically charged environment to that of the 1980s, plus the popularity of horror comedies like Ash vs. Evil Dead, Stand Against Evil, Ghosted, Supernatural even to some degree. Look, what I'm saying is the pump, she is a prime for a Gremlins comeback. So yeah, the Gremlins. That's why they got big, that's why they stayed big, that's how they influenced another generation of little monsters, and why the Gremlins are destined to be big again. Thanks for watching, and remember, no sunlight, no water, and never feed them after midnight. And stay away from the toilets, I guess? I'm talking about myself, not the Gremlins. Anyway, see you next time.